seated, please. Imam साहब, बक्सा लेके आ जाएं, अगर किसी हवाले की ज़रूरत पड़े तो काम आ जाएंगे। Assalamu alaikum. I'm so happy to see this hall full of guests and hosts. And I would love to start this session of questions and answers, please.
Assalamu alaikum, Huzur. The first questioner is Mrs. Beirut from Lithuania.
Assalamu alaikum. I would like to ask you two questions closely related to each other. One of them, knowing the exceptional birth of Jesus Christ, can we place him higher than other prophets? And second question, if the Christians place Jesus so high, what is, to your mind, the main reason that they completely deny him in their everyday life and behavior? Thank you very much.
I think this question should have been best answered by some Christians rather than me, because they know the intricate reasons why they have to do it. But I can only offer a guess. The case of Jesus is a very special case. It's not that of an ordinary prophet of Allah. It is so significant in so many ways that unless you fully realize the significance of Jesus as Messiah, perhaps you cannot fully understand the attitude of Christians to him. They have definitely seen something special in him, which they did not notice or observe or read about in the Old Testament regarding other prophets. And that is why he was specifically entitled Messiah or Christ. So if every prophet shared this with him, he should have also been referred to as a Messiah and a Christ. So the important thing is that what was the significance of this title? And if the significance is correctly understood, then you can only revere such a person to the degree of his true status understood by the title. If you do not understand the significance correctly, then you may go on looking for things which were not meant by God, and may imagine things about the person which did not relate to his reality. So with the case of Christians, I think this second alternative is at work. The significance of Jesus should have been understood with reference to his original reality as he appeared. And what specific task did he perform in the Judaic history, which singles him out as not only as a prophet, but a person holding another status or a position, or let's say, delivering a mission which was not delivered before. And that can be well understood in relation to Jesus' own attitudes, rather than what people of later ages thought about him. A few things are very clear to me. Number one, that Jesus did not change the book, nor did he ever claim to have changed the book. What he changed was attitudes. And the most significant change he brought about was attention to the shell, to change our attention from the shell to the spirit. It was the substance which he emphasized. And that was so highly needed at that time, because the Jewish people had got stuck to the form and shell of the teachings of the Torah, So much so that they thought that if you formally subscribe to God as described literally in Torah, that is quite sufficient, and that is then you really attain the purpose of religion. By performing, for instance, in the case of Muslims nowadays, we see, if you just perform the prayer, but walk out of the mosque as empty as you entered, if you perform the prayer at home as well, but it does not bring about any real change in your spiritual nature and your attitude to God and attitude to His creation. This is just form. This is also a sort of idol worship. It is so close to idol worship that the Jews repeatedly committed the mistake of worshipping a God which could be presented to them visually, which had a formal existence. So this attitude, when hardened, although it hardened around the concept of unity of God, but remained a mere shell, no more. So that is against which Jesus Christ launched a great movement. And it was his emphasis on the substance and spirit of things which ultimately led St. Paul to completely misunderstand him, while those who were directly instructed by him under his own personal spiritual example, they disagreed with Paul and took up a cudgel for a long time for retaining the form as well as spirit and substance. So this is the struggle we find in the early history of Christianity, which answers this question partly, which you have raised, that the struggle was between form and substance, and they were taken separately, as if one would eliminate the necessity of the other. This was not Jesus. Nowhere did he do away with form. What he did was he presented the case of a religion which had no substance left in it, which was without the love of God, and it would not serve any purpose. But the form did serve a purpose, which was to retain the spirit intact. So unfortunately, the division took place between the two extremists. One who saw Jesus as emphasizing the spirit, the others who considered him to have abandoned the form altogether. So when they turned to spirit, then what was left of spirit? There, a new personality of Jesus began to emerge. They thought that Jesus had done away with the law so completely and totally that to live in Jesus became religion in itself. And as it had happened never before in any religious experience, so this was the special Jesus which emerged in the sight of the later day Christians. I mean, those who gradually moved away from the spirit of Jesus, that they thought he must have done away with the form, disposed of the Sharia or the law, so that man could live by his own spiritual entity in himself. And if that spiritual entity of man was at one with the spirit of Jesus, that is holiness, and that is all Jesus brought. So he stood higher above all prophets of Allah, according to them, because by the intricate thinking of Pauline philosophy, he delivered man not from sin, but from the form of Sharia. Then sin and curse and Sharia, that is law, became synonymous to the followers of this philosophy. While the fact is that sin is born out of law, but obedience to God and love of God are also born out of the same. There is a joining point in the law which is brought by prophets, which can never be separated. And such religious philosophies which separate these two things can never survive in essence and in meaning. As Jesus, I'm talking of the general things, the result is that the bifurcation of religion leads to extremist forms and movements. Like in Islam, we notice the movement of Sufism. Sufism is almost exactly on the style of Pauline philosophy. And that also was a reaction to such extremists, observers of form, who observed form meticulously, that is the mullah, who said, if you say your prayer 5 times a day, that is what Islam is, no more. If you read the Quran, whether you understand the meaning or not, doesn't make any difference. Formally pay homage to God and He is happy with you. That is all what He requires. But the Sufi understood the danger of this teaching and said that if a religion does not bring your soul closer to God, and if it is only your body which is given a sort of exercise like PT, then such a religion is not worthy of following. So they separated. But they left the farm aside exactly like St. Paul did, with the result that they started moving away into the wilderness of no law. Practically, they lived in a sort of internal experience which was so misleading in many cases. The ecstasy they felt by thinking of God internally or thinking of their saints and others whom they respected, they did get some sort of exhilaration. And that is what they thought was the living experience of religion. So in reality, if you compare the Sufism with the Pauline philosophy concerning Jesus' message, then you come to realize that this is again a universal phenomenon which occurs everywhere in the world to every religion, only it is seldom recognized as clearly as it should be. So the image of Jesus as stands above all the prophets of God is born out of this misunderstanding. Jesus never broke away from the past. He never rejected even a jot of the Old Testament. When particularly confronted with this allegation, that do you reject the scriptures? He said, no. I have not come to change a jot of the book. I have come to perfect it, to fulfill it. Now this perfection is also, as I have studied, slightly mistranslated or misinterpreted. The word musaddiq is found in the Quran in exactly the same meaning. And according to the Quran, each prophet comes as a musaddiq of the previous ones and of the book, which means all the prophecies found in the books, until they are fulfilled and realized in the form of a promised reformer, they remain incomplete. So when Jesus said, I have come to complete the book, not to change a jot, it meant that the prophecies relating a revolutionary change in attitudes, which was to be brought about by the Messiah, remained incomplete until he had come. So as such, as we see from Islamic vantage point, there is no difference between him and other human prophets except that of changing the wrong attitudes of the people of his own religion to the one which stood in balance and which always could lead to God if you kept both form and spirit of the message equally well before you and practiced both as much as you possibly could. So I think, projecting myself into the minds of others, this is what I think must have happened to them. Again, there was another dilemma which they were facing early in Christian history, which also must have unfortunately led them away from the true Jesus, the living reality of history, to a Jesus which had to be created out of the compulsion of the times. By that I mean that the fact of crucifixion has a background. It has a background in the Old Testament. Why did the Jews so much insist on Jesus hanging by the cross? Has its roots in a biblical prophecy, whereby if a man attributes false things to God which he had not said to him, and if such a man hangs by the tree, which means by the cross, and dies upon the tree, then his being an impostor is proved beyond a shadow of doubt. This was the conspiracy against Jesus. And the Holy Quran presents the whole conspiracy relating to both the ends of Jesus' life, the beginning as well as death, or in whatever form he disappeared. According to the Holy Quran, it was a very heinous conspiracy against the person of Jesus Christ by his opponents of the time to present him to the people as a man with a false beginning, having an unchaste mother, having an illegitimate birth, and a false end, both cursed. So it were two curses which they want to relate to Jesus, which hashed this conspiracy. So the Holy Quran has summed it up in this, is this, وَقَالِهِمْ عَلَى مَرْيَمَ بُهْتَانًا عَظِيمًا وَقَالِهِمْ إِنَّا قَتَلْنَا الْمَسِيحَ عِيسَى ابْنَ مَرْيَمَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ. They said, the Holy Quran says, that the crime of the Jews of his time is twofold. First, they attributed to him an illegitimate birth by claiming that his mother was not chaste. So a false beginning. Then they claimed that they had succeeded in murdering him, and later on cross is also mentioned, which means that they also claim that they murdered him through crucifixion. God denies both these charges in the Quran and presents this as reason enough for returning the curse to his opponents, the Jews, who were hurling this curse upon Jesus. So the argument presented by the Quran is that curse fell squarely upon those who had attributed this false allegation, this curse falsely to Jesus Christ. So now, what happened at the crucifixion? What happened was that the Roman law had condemned him to death, and that Roman law is still found in operation everywhere in the world in the same spirit. That is, once a person is condemned to death by hanging or by any other means, until he dies, the decision remains hanging over his head. If the first attempt fails, another attempt will have to be made. Until the purpose of that condemnation is fulfilled, the threat of death would continue to hang over such a person. Now, this is what is the most important thing in this relation, in this regard, which should be kept in mind. Then I'll connect these two things with the question you raised. Now, the dilemma of the Christians was that if they claimed openly that the law and the Jews had failed to kill Jesus or murder him or condemn him to death to its end, then whenever a claimant would appear and he was dragged to the Roman court that I have seen Jesus Christ myself alive, it would be he who would be condemned to severe punishment or even death, because he would be considered an accessory after the crime, after the fact. Why did he not capture him? Why did he not report the matter to the law? So it was a very serious crime to make such a claim. On the other hand, if they admitted that Jesus had died upon cross, then the biblical sword would hang over their heads, informing them that this man whom you revere so much is proved to be a false person, according to the criterion presented by the Bible itself. So he was an impostor, no more. This was a dilemma faced by the Christians. And those who witnessed his survival had only one option: to call it a revival instead of survival. So if you change the terminology just a little bit, instead of calling it a case of survival, if you presented it as a case of revival, then law could not touch you. Because once death was delivered, then the person is free to walk away. So this is why in the beginning this was the stance taken by his close followers and lovers, and that is why they saved their face against the Jews as well. They said, you say if an impostor hangs by the tree, he would die, and his death would prove him to be an impostor. And you say this happened in the case of Jesus Christ. But you don't realize that he revived from the dead, which means that he was not an ordinary prophet, he was more than a prophet. So the case of a prophet was not applicable. You are judging him from the formula which is applicable only to the prophets. But if somebody revives from the dead, most certainly he stands beyond the ordinary status of prophets. Now, the word so often used in the New Testament, which was an expression of endearment only, according to me and us, that is Son of God. That helped them. They said, look here, he had to be a little Son of God. No ordinary mortal can revive, come to life again from the dead. So you are trying to pull his leg down below the human level. But what you prove is simply this, that he was not human, all right, but beyond humans. Not a prophet, but beyond a prophet, above a prophet. And by the same juggling of the words, they proved his birth to be an additional factor to as an argument in their favor. They said, now you turn to the question of birth, and now you understand it better. He did not have a known father married to Mary because he was not son of a mortal. So he must have been begotten by the conjugation, sort of something, between God and Mary. So both these points emerge as the most important and pivotal points. Correct understanding of them is what would lead you to the correct understanding of Jesus Christ, and in no other way you can understand the fact of Jesus. So both Jews and Christians faltered on these 2 points. The Jews wanted to prove the point by saying he got killed on cross, so he must have been false. He was delivered by a mother without a husband, so he must have a false beginning. In answer to both these, the Holy Quran relates the words of Jesus to us, that is, what he expressed to God by way of gratitude to him, that he had blessed him in this way. And the words run, Salamun alayya, yawma wulidtu, wa yawma amutu, wa yawma ubatu hayya. They say, my birth was cursed, my death was cursed, and so I will not be raised. Peace be on me, because my birth was blessed, my death will be blessed, and it will not be through murder or killing. Amut is not an expression used for those who are murdered or killed. The word maut here applies simply to a natural death. So it was not only a prayer or an expression of gratitude, but it was also a prophecy by Jesus, that my birth was clear. There's no doubt about it. But how shall you know? You can only know if the same prophecy which I'm making, or the same expression of gratitude I'm making, is proved in the latter part, in the event of death. If I escape murder, then my first claim will also be taken as true and valid. If there I'm proved wrong, then I could be taken to be wrong in both these places. So that is why the Holy Quran says he did not die upon cross. They failed to murder him. What was certain was only this fact, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ يَقِينًا. They certainly failed to murder him. Crucifixion was just an attempt. Like murder attempts, when they fail, you can never say somebody is murdered. An attempt of murder is something else, and if crucifixion is only to the degree of an attempted murder, then it should not mean that he was crucified to the end of death. So this is how the Holy Quran resolves the issue. And a new personality of Jesus appears by the study of the Holy Quran, which is in the middle path, which leaves no room for any extreme attitude as taken by either Jews or by the Christians of today. And here lies the greatness of Jesus, the true greatness. We find him to be a very special prophet, no doubt, a prophet who stood till the end by truth and did not care what happened to him, who suffered the agonies of crucifixion, yet did not change his view and his belief and his claims. And yet he knew that he would be saved from the cross because he was a true man. He knew it because he had prayed to God to take away the bitter cup from him. And God must have promised him. Otherwise, this last cry, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, was out of place. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani means that he was sure that God would fulfill his promise of saving him from this ignoble death. And there's an utter cry of not despondency, but of a sort of prayer which is so rich in meaning that it is impossible for such a prayer to be rejected. So the last we hear from Jesus is, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And it's impossible for God to have unheard this cry of anguish from a dear prophet who suffered till the end. and stood firm in his loyalty to God. So he was saved. He was saved, and the first proof of his having been saved lies in the fact that when he was taken down from cross, his body was, an ointment was hurriedly prepared and applied to his body. While most certainly it was not the custom of the Jewish people to anoint the bodies or to apply any ointment to the body of the dead. Ointments are only applied in an attempt to either mitigate the suffering or to heal the wounds. There is no other purpose. And it served both these purposes. It mitigated the suffering as well as healed his wounds. So the Jesus we see walking out of the sepulchre is not a ghost, because it is what he himself claims. As he appears before his disciples and surprises them by his presence as a living form, because it was said he gave up his ghost. They must have heard it and taken it too seriously. So they thought he was a ghost. But Jesus said, no, I am not a ghost. So it gives light to the impression of a viewer that he gave up the ghost. He never admitted it. He said, come here. Come and touch my wounds. Here, there, my hands. And see, I am the same person in the same body. I was crucified. And I am alive here before you. This was a 100% open and shut case of a person who had been attempted to be murdered, but his enemies failed to achieve the purpose, who almost died but did not, and survived the attempts at his life. Now, when you read this in relation to a prophecy of Jesus Christ, then the whole picture emerges as clear as day. When they demanded, some of them, of the Jewish people or other opponents, there are so many people belonging to different religions and beliefs, who all opposed Jesus together as a body. They were non-believers, they were people who believed in myths and ideologies other than the Jewish ideology. They always gathered around him and put him to many tests and questions. At one moment, at one occasion, when they required from him a great miracle, so they could see with their own eyes that he was from God. I don't remember the exact words, but he said, the people of this age were this and that. They demand a miracle, but no miracle will be shown unto them except the miracle of Jonah of the fish. Now, what was that miracle? Was it a case of revival, or was it a case of survival against all odds? Most certainly. There are no two opinions about this. That Jonah presented a case of survival against all odds, not a case of revival from the dead. So as I'm reconstructing the events of crucifixion and what happened following, when you remember this prophecy of Jesus Christ, then the case is cleansed. It's a very clear case of a true prophet who was true, and God had saved him. And then, after such attempts, when Allah saves his prophets and dear ones, they're always told to migrate. So Jesus did. Now, this is the last part by which, last part of an integral part of the Christian beliefs, by which they attempt to prove Jesus' status to be beyond all other prophets. They died natural deaths here on earth, but he disappeared into heaven, bodily. Why the necessity of such a belief? There's some reasons and valid reasons for that. First of all, if they claim that he had not died, or he had died and again became alive after death, then the first question first demand which would be made upon them would be, ask him to appear before us then. If he did not die, then his body has become eternal, immortal, whatever form it is. Because once somebody survives death or survives death, comes to life again, then he can't be killed again, by no means. So the first logical question which should have been addressed to them and they were confronted with was, all right, let Jesus appear before us. So he did not appear. The second, if not, where has he gone? Where is his body? Why has he disappeared altogether? Is he hiding? And if he's hiding, why don't you produce him? Or the law will deal with you. If you're hiding the body of a criminal, dead or alive, he must be presented to prove that he ultimately got killed according to the purpose of the law. But these two demands could not be met by them. So this concept of ascension to heaven was born naturally out of this dilemma. Now previously, some Christian scholars used to quote Mark, I think it was Mark, where in the last 12 verses it was said that Jesus ascended to the heaven. But now all the Christian scholars have agreed unanimously that these 12 verses where this is mentioned are false. They are not found in the original text at all. They were added later on. So there is no single proof of Jesus' ascension. But some excuse had to be discovered, had to be invented to prove that he lived. But why is he not visible? Because he has gone somewhere. So they did not want to disclose the identity of his migration. So they said he had ascended to heaven to further prove the point that he was not immortal, but he was literally the Son of God. This is the dilemma of Christianity which helped St. Paul to legendize the fact of crucifixion and to mythify the noble reality of Jesus Christ. And because Roman Empire was already a most fertile recipient soil for such philosophies, because they themselves had believed in Trinity before. They themselves had believed for centuries in mythologies and God, humans taking forms of God, descending from heaven or ascending to heaven, but humans taking forms of God, or God taking form of humans. So this was no alien philosophy to them. And that is why they accepted it in large numbers. And it was there that St. Paul struck the bonanza for Christianity. So these, I feel, are the reasons why the Christians have to believe in this mythified form of Jesus Christ, while I believe it would be far greater loyalty to Jesus if they stuck to his reality, which is far more noble. Myths are not noble. They're imaginary things. With powers, myths live with powers which are not shared by human beings. So what are we to them? What are they to us? But a person, being a human being, being immortal, reaches such heights of great sacrifice and perfect example as Jesus did. That is the noble image which is worthy of all love. So we are not an opponent of Christianity. We are the true lover of Jesus Christ, and we invite Christians to look at that great hero in religious history from our eyes and revere him the more and love him the more, not at the cost of unity of God, but in perfect agreement with the unity of God. Have I answered your question? Thank you.
We now invite Mr. Keith Wakely from Wimbledon. He has 2 questions, please.
Thank you. The Bible tells us, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. What is your interpretation of the pure in heart? And the second one, I read in the Times about 2 weeks ago that a charity was buying slaves' freedom in Sudan. And if I may just read the first paragraph, a British charity working in Sudan is buying back Christian slaves kidnapped by Arab militias and forced to become Muslims. What
They are being forced to become Muslims?
Yes.
By whom?
By the Arab militias.
So I do not subscribe to that
And
forced conversion, and this is why we are made subject of persecution by the mainstream Muslims. We do not subscribe to such views because we consider such views as absolutely against Islamic teachings and against the fundamental teachings of Islam, particularly.
Yes. I rather felt that you would answer like that.
Yes.
But are there any other forms of slavery in Islam or not?
But we'll come to that question in full later on. First, with the first question.
Yes.
The first question was perhaps, what is the meaning of the purity of heart?
Purity of heart.
Right.
Thank you.
You see, the purity of heart is not a religious term belonging to a certain religion or a certain place or a certain area or time. Purity of heart has always been the subject and the most essential subject of discussion of all such faiths which term themselves as religions, even those who do not believe in God or apparently do not believe in God, like Buddhists, like Jainists and some others, who have gone away from, like the philosophies of Taoism, etc. They're also referred to as godless philosophies. Although I disagree with that, that's a different thing altogether. What I mean to say is, as they present religion, the central point is always purification of heart. How can you meet this end? By what means? It is there that the religious teachings differ. Those who believe in God, they also believe that without your coming into some sort of communion with God, purification of heart cannot be achieved. To live with God, to live in God, means that you follow His attributes, such attributes which are within the human capacity to follow and acquire. So this also explains the meaning of man having been created after the nature of God. God has created man ultimately to become good. If the basic fundamental design of man was not good, it would not have been possible for man ever to become good. So the purity of heart is to return to the original design. That is why even those religions who do not believe in God, they somehow acquire this. What they have to do is, they have to delve deeper into their own nature. And they reach the same ultimate end of discovering an innate goodness in all human beings. So they say we have discovered the secret from within us. The religion says, no, in that exercise, you may even be misled by your own views and thoughts and cultural influences and the influences of the age, and you may think that you have reached the truth, but it has to be verified from an outer truth, by an outer truth. Without that, there cannot be a certainty regarding your having reached the source of truth or purification. In this regard, Islam has a very clear attitude and very logical and sensible attitude. In fact, you can't do away with it in any form. You have to agree because it's so logical. The founder of Ahmadiyya community, Hazrat Masih Maud has written volumes on this subject, purity of heart. And he has likened it to all human faculties which are all of them dependent on an outer reality which correlates with them. For instance, if the eyes are good and the sight is perfect and healthy, if there is no sun shining, no light coming from the heaven, they can't see. So inner truth is only to the extent of your being capable of receiving the outer truth. The ears can be absolutely healthy and perfect, yet if there is no vibration in the air, no sound, they won't hear anything. Taste, of course we can taste things if we are healthy, but there must be something to create the taste. Empty mouth and empty stomach cannot taste anything. So this is the explanation put forward by Hazrat Masih Maud, the founder of the Ahmadiyya community, in relation to inner truth and outer truth and their interrelationship. So the purity of heart is the sum total of these 5 senses, where they ultimately converge and ultimately create one single entity. If all the 5 senses are pure and healthy, and if they are in communion with the outer sources which are corresponding to them, then the heart is purified, without a shadow of doubt. Without it, it may be on way to purification. It may be innocent. But perfect purification, a purposeful purification cannot be achieved without the meeting together of inner truth and outer truth. That is what we understand by these terms, and I hope this will also be acceptable to many. Thank you. The second question was relating to
slavery and what forms of slavery does Islam have?
You see, Islam, as I have many times before explained, is misunderstood in many regards, also in respect of slavery. The Holy Prophet once said, how can you make a person slave whom God had given birth, whom God had created as a free person? So this is a very important declaration. No man has a right to enslave a person born free. But the matters do not end here. If you have inherited a system of slavery where others had enslaved people, rightfully or wrongfully, and where the society had accepted a form of transfer of this slavery through exchange of commodities or money, etc., then what should be the attitude? That is the second question. Islam did not do away with the inherited institution of slavery with one declaration that free all your slaves, because that would have done greater damage to the society if it was attempted in one single stroke. Because all the economy of the period was so interwoven with the system of slavery of that time that it would, in the name of goodness, it may ultimately end up in some evil rather than goodness. And what would those slaves do? How would they survive? Who would take care of them? They had no right to be equally treated according to the society around. They would immediately be recaptured by the non-Muslims living around, because as such they had no right to live freely. There were many possible dangers to the slaves themselves, which must have ultimately resulted in this teaching from Allah, that if you do not enslave people without your right to enslave them, this is right. But you must also begin to liberate slaves. And herein is the Quranic teaching, which is incomparable with any other teaching in the world. The ways and means suggested in the Quran and enforced many a time by which slaves could be liberated are so many that it is impossible for these means to be taken seriously and for the society to implement them, and yet slavery to survive within a few generations. It must come to an end. For various small crimes, mistakes, follies, this and that, omissions, the remedy suggested by the Quran is free a slave, liberate a slave. And then the Holy Quran says that the best people in the sight of Allah are those who liberate slaves. So this resulted in a mass movement among the Muslims for the liberation of slaves. And when there was no other means legally to turn the free people into slaves, then automatically slavery must have come to an end. Why it did not was because in many other cases the Muslims of the following generation did not practice Islam. They ignored Islamic injunctions wherever it suited them. And this happens with every society. So the fault lies not with the Quranic teachings, but with those people who took the teaching lightly or misunderstood the teaching. Now, in this regard, I must also point out that the teachings regarding slaves also must be understood according to the Quranic injunctions and the ahadith, that is the traditions or instructions of Hazrat Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself and his practice. According to Islamic injunctions, the picture which emerges is that if you have a slave, you must treat him with honor, with equality. You must feed him with the food with which you feed your own family. You must dress them in a manner that you dress your own family members. You must not speak harsh words to them. If you strike them, you may earn the wrath of Allah. And the only remedy for this, if you have done it being carried away by your sentiments or anger, is to liberate the slave. Now, this was done so repeatedly and consistently by Hazrat Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that there are many an example where a slave committed a mistake and somebody lost his temper and struck him. And once it happened many times, but it so happened that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself was coming in the direction of the person who was striking his slave. Not viciously to the degree that he could have broken his legs or things, but he struck at him. And Hazrat Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam shouted, he didn't shout normally, but raised his voice and said, Abu Masud, Abu Masud. Oh, what is happening? He understood the tone of urgency and displeasure. And he turned and he paled at seeing his impression. He said, O Prophet of Allah, I liberate this slave immediately now. He said, had you not done this, you had earned hell. So the attitude towards slaves is also so important that the slavery does not become as heinous to look at if the slavery is practiced in the short term that it is practiced, should be practiced in Islam, according to the instructions of the Holy Quran. And the love that was generated because of this teaching between slave and the master was so intense sometimes that given the opportunity of liberation, the slaves themselves would reject to benefit from that. It particularly happened in the case of Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah's own slave, Zaid. His parents were some nobles from perhaps Persia or some other country, who had lost their son, and they didn't know much about him, where he had gone and disappeared. When the fame of Islam spread far and wide, they heard the name of their own son mentioned in relation to the Holy Prophet. So they ultimately approached him and said, "You claim to be the Prophet of Allah. We have come here not to accept Islam, but to claim what belongs to us, our son." So he said, "Yes, he's yours for the taking. No problem." He called Zaid and said, "Here are your parents. And I, with all with all my heart, I permit you, without any reservation, to go with them and return to your home and your own land." He looked up at him, said, "O Prophet of Allah, not after I have known you. It's impossible." Turned to his parents and said, "I know your parents, I respect and love you, but I love him more." So it was the slavery of love which had been transformed from the slavery of a cruel form, against which no human can really take an exception. So if you read the true teachings of the Holy Quran regarding slavery, then it does not appear to be such an heinous thing as normally it is related to. Now, things have changed, I know. There is still slavery practiced in Saudi Arabia and some other Muslim countries, most unfortunately, because they exploit the poverty of some poor nations. And they think, which we consider absolutely wrong, that if they go to India, to Madras, some other backward countries parts of India, where even the parents of a poor child are compelled to sell that child for the sake of economic necessity. At least, if not for their own sake, for the sake of the child itself, because they know he would be better fed outside and better clad outside. So they sell and they buy them. But the interesting thing is that except for a few cases in Sheikhdom, most often in Saudi Arabia, the slaves are treated with such equality that those Ahmadis which have been there, which have been moving in and out of the palaces of the princes, they have borne witness to me that we have seen the slaves to be clad like them, to be sitting on the same sofas, sharing the same style of life, so much that sometimes it was very difficult for us to find which was the master and which was the slave. Bad as it may be, but not as bad as slavery has been practiced elsewhere in the world. Particularly, as I've mentioned, the earlier periods of slavery, forced enslavement of people of Africa, and the torture they suffered. And despite the fact that there is no slavery in America, no legality in slavery, yet the blacks are treated even worse than slaves. Somehow, very cleverly, they're kept at a third or fourth rate level, and they're rotting in slums, and there's no hope for their rise to the equal level with the whites. this is unwritten slavery, but much more heinous than the slavery practiced in Saudi Arabia, for instance. Because a whole people have lost the purpose, direction, the end product of their life. And that is why, you know, with people like Farah Khan and so on, they are capable of gathering even 1 million people by way of protest. They're misled, I know. When I go there, I meet the leadership and I tell them this is no way of liberating yourself. The best way is to liberate yourself from the evils and ills of the society. Liberate yourself from the crime. Then none could keep you suppressed, because there is no legal instrument here by which you could be suppressed if you benefit from the options and possibilities of such gateways as are open to all, provided you behave well, provided you offer sacrifices, provided you get education and emphasize the role of morality. Then no society on earth can keep you suppressed. This is my message against the message of Farah Khan. But unfortunately, people want excitement and want cheap and shortcuts to success. And there is no cheap and short cut to success. So this is all I could say here at this moment, please. I know your deep interest, your dedication to the purpose of liberating slaves and doing away with the slavery, whether it is apparent or subdued. Am I right? Thank you.